Welcome back to the podcast where we explore how small mistakes, overlooked warnings, and human errors can spiral into devastating consequences. I'm Eckhard Jan, and this is Error 1. Today we are revisiting one of the worst industrial disasters in human history, the Bhopal Disaster. It was just after midnight on December 3rd, 1984 in the city of Bhopal, India. Most people were asleep, unaware that a silent killer was making its way through their neighborhoods. Thousands would never wake up. Let's dive into what happened, what caused it, and the haunting legacy it left behind. The population in India has been growing ever since. This was the case in the 50s and 60s and continues today. The demand for food was correspondingly high. Indian farmers consistently used fertilizers and pesticides to increase their yields. The market for these products is still expanding. The American chemical company Union Carbide wanted to profit from such demand and built a chemical plant in Bhopal at the end of the 60s. The city was located in the middle of India in the state of Madhya Pradesh, far away from large cities. In the 60s, Bhopal was a sleepy little town with fewer than 100,000 inhabitants. During the decades that followed, the number grew rapidly over 900,000. The chemical plant of Union Carbide was originally located at the gates of the city. Now it was surrounded by densely built-up areas. That's not really a good prerequisite in case of a chemical occurrence or accident. And unfortunately, that's exactly what happened. The catastrophe occurred during the night on the 3rd December of 1984 at around 12:40 a.m. A storage tank at the Union Carbide India Limited pesticide plant began releasing a toxic cloud of methyl isocyanate gas, a chemical used to make pesticides. Within hours, the gas spread over the city of Bhopal. 40 tons of this chemical methyl isocyanate, or abbreviated MIC, escaped uncontrollably. Thousands of people died. More than 500,000 were affected. It was the largest chemical disaster on the Indian continent to this day. But what happened? What led to this accident? Let's take a look at the error chain again. In the early 1960s, India was heavily dependent on imported food. The population was growing and people were hungry. In order to get India independent from these imports, the Indian government decided to massively support its own agriculture. To achieve this, they needed chemical plants and factories to produce fertilizers and pesticides. One of the world's leading chemical companies for such products was Union Carbide. It did not take long for the government to reach an agreement with Union Carbide on an independent Indian company. It was called Union Carbide India Limited, or short UCIL. The UCIL factory started its operation in 1969, initially to produce fertilizers. 8 years later, in 1977, UCIL began converting the plant to produce a specific pesticide. It was marketed under the name Sevin and was used especially in agriculture. The annual output of this pesticide was 2,500 tons. Chemical ingredients were needed to produce it. The most important one was this already mentioned methyl isocyanate. To better understand what happened in Bhopal and why this methyl isocyanate was so critical, I'm delighted to talk today to Dr. Gabi Prinz. She holds a doctorate in chemistry and can explain much better than I can do the background and criticality of this chemical. Hello Gabi, thank you for joining us today.
Hallo.
The first question we're interested in is what is methyl isocyanate and what's behind it?
This
chemical is a basic substance that is used to produce pesticides. In other words, it is used to make pesticides that are toxic to plants, fungi, or insects.
Okay, so why is this methyl isocyanate so problematic when it comes into contact with water?
I need to expand a little on that. You need to know that this methyl isocyanate evaporates at 40 degrees Celsius, which means it boils. And that's why you shouldn't let it get that hot. If you look at the regulations, you will always see that it should be stored at 4 degrees. Because at 20 degrees, a considerable amount evaporates, and if you put this liquid methyl isocyanate on your hand, which you shouldn't do now because you would probably die, then it will be gone very quickly. Then the hand quickly gets cold. It has evaporated. In addition, when water is added to methyl isocyanate, a chemical reaction occurs in which the mixture heats up incredibly quickly. And the reaction of the methyl isocyanate with water also produces carbon dioxide gas. This heat ensures that the MiC boils in the container. The pressure in your container rises, more gas is produced, more of your methyl isocyanate boils away, and the pressure in your container rises, the gas is released. And you can imagine that this is quite problematic because the container can only withstand a certain pressure. And at some point, this container, which contains this water-methyl isocyanate mixture, will no longer be able to withstand the pressure and will explode. Then a lot of overheated methyl isocyanate is released in one go. The whole soup boils in all places at the same time, and an incredible amount of gaseous methyl isocyanate forms as a mixture, which is then heavier than air, and the whole environment is then released into the surroundings. And because it's heavier than air, it creates a toxic cloud that nobody on the ground can escape.
Okay, that's obviously what happened in Bhopal. One more question. Last question. Why is this methyl isocyanate so dangerous?
First of all, methyl isocyanate irritates the eyes. You don't even notice it, I've read. You can go blind later. But worse are the direct effects on the respiratory tract, which becomes irritated at higher concentrations, and the lungs are so damaged that you suffocate. There are also long-term consequences. There were and still are higher miscarriage rates. Interestingly, not much was known about what methyl isocyanate does to the human body until the catastrophe in Bhopal. With this catastrophe, there was a huge open-air experiment where you could see what the long-term effects were.
Okay, now we have a good understanding of why it is so problematic and dangerous to handle methyl isocyanate. At this point, I would like to say thank you, Gabby. Thank you very much for your explanation and comments.
Gerne. With pleasure.
Let's get back to the background of Bhopal. In the 1970s and 1980s, methyl isocyanate was an inexpensive way of producing pesticides. Even the German chemical company Bayer used it back then. However, almost all manufacturers switched to other production methods later on. This made production much more complex and expensive, but only Union Carbide stuck with the cheaper production methods. Indian trade unions complained early on about environmental pollution at the Bhopal plant. Unexpectedly, demand for pesticides declined during the early 1980s. The plant in Bhopal was operating at less than half its capacity due to weakening demand. Nevertheless, production in Bhopal continued. The Union Carbide headquarters in West Virginia, USA, was aware of the problem. Top management considered shutting down the plant completely. But by that time, a lot of money had already been invested in Bhopal. So the factory was kept open. Instead, the goal was to cut costs. A strict cost-cutting program was imposed on the Indian management in Bhopal. Meanwhile, American engineers were sent to inspect the Bhopal facilities. They realized a number of critical issues and criticized specifically the lax safety measures. They informed the local managers that an emergency plan was needed urgently. In particular, insufficient or even missing alarm and evacuation plans were criticized. This would be highly important in case of a gas accident at the plant. And indeed, they didn't need to wait long for the first industrial accidents to happen. In December 1981, a worker accidentally inhaled a large quantity of toxic phosgene gas. As a result, the worker died a few hours later. However, UCIL management argued that it was his own fault because he had taken off his protective mask. 2 months later, in February 1982, another accident occurred. 25 workers were injured when a pump seal failed and considerable quantities of MIC phosgene and hydrochloric acid gases escaped from the plant. Although they survived, they had to receive medical treatment in a hospital. The morale among the Indian workforce was deteriorating. Some workers even helped a journalist to secretly enter the plant. He observed and documented the poor condition of the facility and the lax or even non-existent safety standards. A local newspaper published his report with the title, "Wake up, people of Bhopal, you are dancing on a volcano." But all warnings that a massive leak was possible and could have catastrophic consequences were ignored by the responsible managers. Instead, additional cost-cutting measures were implemented during 1983. Many workers were fired. Employee morale sank to an all-time low. Those who could looked for a new job elsewhere. The most experienced employees left the company and were replaced by inexperienced workers from other units of the UCIL group. In 1984, the losses amounted to several $million. The plant continued to make losses. As demand remained weak, capacity was reduced to just 20%. Daily staffing numbers were also reduced in the respective units. From the originally planned 3 foremen and 12 employees per shift, there was now only 1 foreman and 6 employees. Ultimately, the training of all employees was also reduced to the absolute minimum required by law. So, we have a situation where the plant is run with fewer staff per shift, new and inexperienced staff who received hardly any training, low morale due to staff cuts, faulty systems, and, above all, poor safety standards. Believe me, this is not a good prerequisite for a chemical plant when dealing with hazardous substances. In October 1984, UCIL began using up the last stocks of phosgene and methylamine at the Bhopal plant to produce the final batch of MIC. There were 3 chemical tanks for MIC, each with a capacity of 68,000 liters, which equals 18,000 gallons. None of these tanks should be filled to more than 50%, which is the equivalent of about 30 tons of liquid MIC. The remainder of the tanks were filled with nitrogen. The pressure was high enough that the liquid could be pumped out at any time. Unfortunately, one of the 3 tanks was leaking. Not really a big surprise given the general condition of the facility. A valve was defective and the nitrogen pressure could not be maintained. This resulted in an unplanned overfill. Instead of the maximum permissible 30 tons, there were suddenly 42 tons of this toxic MIC in the tank. The management was forced to temporarily stop production of the last batch. On December 1st, technicians tried to get the tank working again. Unfortunately, this did not work. Most of the safety systems for methyl isocyanate were also defective. On December 2nd, the pipes were to be flushed with water. They hoped that they could somehow be able to restore its functionality. At 9:30 p.m., the employees began flushing the pipes. Unfortunately, the rusty vent valve behind the flush was also blocked. The water could not escape or exit at the intended valve. Instead, it collected in the pipes. A technician turned off the water, but a plant manager disagreed and ordered to continue flushing. Water reached inintendedly the nitrogen system through a bypass pipe until around 10:30 p.m. But, to make matters worse, the pressure relief valve for nitrogen was also defective. The investigation board later found that water entered the chemical tank containing 42 tons of MIC through defective valves. As we have already heard, MIC in combination with water develops extremely high temperatures, with massively increasing pressure at the same time. In the control room, a technician noticed that the pressure was increasing, but it was still within the normal range, so he disregarded the indication. Shortly afterwards, technicians noticed leaking MIC. They could smell it. In the dark, they tried to find the leak, but unfortunately without success. Instead, they took their mandated tea break and wanted to discuss what to do next. By now, it was midnight. A technician in the control room observed that the pressure had now exceeded its limit. Shortly thereafter, the needle was stuck at the maximum display value. It didn't move. The pressure was twice as high as actually permitted. Way too many things in this plant were already not working properly, so the technician didn't trust the pressure reading either. Instead, he went to the tanks to check the sensors. He thought he might be able to see the true pressure at the sensors. As soon as he arrived, the first safety valve popped and rumbled. He felt extremely hot steam escaping from the tank. The plant manager was alerted immediately. The manager also tried to get the critical situation under control with cooling and finally an emergency shutdown. Unfortunately, the freon gas required for emergency cooling had already been removed from the Bhopal facility months before. There was no longer any way to prevent the vaporized MIC gas from escaping. Alarm was triggered, but only within the factory premises. The managers didn't want to wake or unsettle the surrounding population in the middle of the night. At approximately 1 a.m. in the morning, people woke up coughing violently, their eyes burning, many unable to breathe. Some dropped dead in their homes. Others ran blindly into the streets, choking and collapsing. Many ran in panic to the municipal hospital. Unfortunately, the wind drove the gigantic cloud of gas in exactly this direction. It can be assumed that many people were exposed to the strongest gas contamination on the way to the hospital. Doctors and nurses in the hospital were completely helpless and overwhelmed as they were unable to classify the symptoms. They were unaware of the fatal effects of methyl isocyanate. It took 2 hours before the whole public was alerted. By then, 40 tons of this toxic gas had already spread throughout the area. Most of the residents of Bhopal smelled the gas before they were officially alerted. By then, it was already too late for many of them. In the days that followed, hospitals were overwhelmed. There was no antidote, and many doctors didn't even know what the gas was. Dead bodies lined the streets. Livestock was dead. Water sources were contaminated as well. The initial death toll was officially reported at around 3,000 people, but over the next few weeks, that number climbed to 15,000. And over the decades, it's estimated that more than 500,000 people were affected, many still suffering from chronic illnesses, birth defects, and psychological trauma to this day. And the survivors? They were left with nothing. To this day, children are born in Bhopal with severe birth defects. People suffer from cancer, lung disease, and blindness. Many live in poverty, unable to work, or receive proper medical care. Union Carbide denied responsibility for the disaster. They claimed that this was technically impossible and therefore only sabotage or terrorism could be considered. Interestingly, they still hold on to this claim until today. But how likely is this hypothesis? It is known and documented that there had already been a number of gas accidents at the Bhopal chemical plant before the tragic event. This does not seem to bother Union Carbide. Instead, it is claimed that it was technically impossible for water to reach the tank. Don't you find it astonishing that this system, above all things, was supposed to be working perfectly, while other technical systems were known to be defective? It was also known that the employees were inexperienced and poorly trained. But one individual was supposed to have proceeded in such a sophisticated way that this intricate plan set a chain of events in motion leading to the disaster? And he wasn't even worried about endangering himself? I leave it up to you to decide whether it was actually sabotage, but I personally have my doubts. I believe an unfortunate error chain is more likely and also more plausible. Union Carbide eventually paid a settlement of $470 million, a fraction of what was really needed. No one from the US company served ever jail time. In India, some local executives were convicted decades later, but with only light sentences. Dow Chemical, which later bought Union Carbide, has refused to accept liability. The plant site remains contaminated until today. And what was error 1? To find out, we have to go back even further, to the origins of Union Carbide. The first major incident occurred in 1927, when Union Carbide was involved in a tunnel construction project near Charleston, West Virginia. During construction of the almost 3-mile-long Hawk's Nest Tunnel, workers were exposed to high levels of silica dust. No protective masks were provided. They were exposed without any protection. Protective masks were provided to the supervisors only, even though they only briefly inspected the construction site. At least 1,000 workers, mostly impoverished African Americans, died within a year. This incident became known as the Hawk's Nest Tunnel Disaster. The companies involved settled out of court. But did it change the approach to safety standards and protection? In the 1970s, Union Carbide was the second largest chemical company in the USA. However, they were nowhere near as profitable as their immediate competitor DuPont. They cut costs, made bad decisions, and were sued by the well-known lawyer Ralph Nader for inadequate environmental protection. Union Carbide tried to ignore the problems. Eventually, they were forced by the government and had to spend a lot of money on environmental regulations. I wouldn't be surprised if this was also a reason to build chemical plants abroad, such as India. Even in the company's origin, a culture can be recognized that can be described as the opposite of a good era culture. This obviously continued from 1927 until the Bhopal Disaster in 1984. I'm convinced that a genuine, functioning era culture would have ensured that problems could have been identified and defects eliminated at an early stage. With a good era culture, the company could have broken the error chain in time. It would have saved the health of more than 500,000 people in Bhopal. And that is why I am so passionate about recognizing error 1, because everything begins for a reason. And that's it for this episode of Error 1. If you found this story compelling, make sure to subscribe and leave a review. I hope that we all can learn from the errors of Bhopal and act for a better and safer future. If you want to learn more about this concept, you can now download my award-winning book Error 1 or just visit www.error1.net. With this in mind, I say thank you very much. As we say in Germany, bleiben Sie sicher, stay safe, and talk to you next time. And remember, small errors can have massive consequences.